Alrighty, my name is Alyssa Graves, designer of Brook's Designs and Apparel. Today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make a slip midi skirt. I know I see it on here, so I have with me Bethany, correct?
Yes.
Awesome, thanks for coming today. So we'll kind of go through, we'll talk you through and let's take measurements first for our project. It's going to be the easiest way to do it. I am not a math person, so if I lay it all out for me to begin with, it's a lot easier when it comes time to map it out and sew it. So you won't need any pattern pieces. You should have your 2 yards of whatever fabric you're using for your skirt, and then some 1-inch wide elastic with you. If you have a tape measure, we'll take our measurements. Mapping out something, want to think about it as in halves. So with our skirt, we're going to have 2 pieces. We'll have a front and a back. They'll be completely identical, so that way the measurements are extremely easy to do without having to have a pattern piece. So I'm just going to go through and take my measurements, and you can as well. So the first measurement, waist measurement. So you're going to go at the smallest part of your actual waist. Typically this is about 2 to 3 inches above your belly button for most people. So you just want to take your tape measure. And get your waist. My waist is at a 29. And then we'll do our hip, and that's going to be at the fullest part of our, basically our bum area. So where your actual, if you were to lift your leg, your hip crease, this is truly where your hip actually is. So we will measure our hip. Just make sure it goes all the way around your bum and where that crease is. And I'm hippie, let me tell you. My hips are like at a 43.5. So, that'll be your hip measurement. I'll just call it 43. And then for our length, so basically this is going to be as long as you want it to be. So the skirt itself will start at your natural waist and wherever you want it to hit midi length on you. For me, I like to go about 3 inches past where my knee is I put the end of my tape measure wherever I want it to end, and then just hold it to my waist and kind of just take a look at how long I want it to be through here. Seems about right. So mine's right around 30 to 30.5, so I'll call it 30. Okay, so when we have our measurements, what we'll end up doing, so this is your full measurement of all the way around your circumference of your body. We're going to take all these measurements, we're going to divide them all by 2. I got my handy dandy Texas Instruments calculator because I'm very fancy like that. Mm-hmm. So 14.5 for my waist, 21.5 for my hip, and total length, that won't change because this is what it is. So these are what our halves are going to be before we have our seam allowance. So as far as seam allowance goes, seam allowance is the amount that you're going to use for your actual seam. So any garment that you wear has a seam allowance. It's literally going to be where you come past where you're at. So let me show you on this. This is actually a midi skirt that I had made back in around the holiday time when I did it for our holiday photos. So what this actual seam allowance is, I didn't finish these edges, so don't judge me. Your seam allowance is going to be how much we have past where the actual seam is. Today though, for ours, that way we don't have to use a serger, we're actually going to use French seams on the inside, and it'll show you guys how to do that. It's extremely easy and it's a very clean cut on the interior of your garment. So for our actual seam allowance for French seams, we want 1 inch total per seam. So when we're here, we're looking at our waist and our hip. And really the main measurement we want is our hip. This measurement here is truly for when we get to our elastic here at the end, because essentially we're cutting a giant rectangle for this. So if 21.5 is our total across here, we want 1 inch on each side. So we'll add 2 inches to this. So it's going to be 23.5 for me and my hip measurement. But then I also want to add what we call ease. So even though we're going to be cutting our skirt on the bias, we want ease. So when I talk about ease, that's the amount of extra fabric you have, so that way when you're wearing your garment, it's not completely skin tight up against you. I would say per each panel, you want to have, I'd say, an inch of ease on here. So, and I'll just do an inch and a half, so why not? So 25.5 plus 1.5 is 25. So that's gonna be my total across measurement for my hip when I'm measuring out my fabric. So essentially, when we look at our fabric, so here's my fabric piece folded in half, we're gonna be cutting along what's called the bias. The bias, typically when you have an edge, so this is our selvage edge, and I'll show you this on our fabric here in a second. When we cut along the bias, typically most pattern pieces go in the direction of the fabric. Instead of going in the direction of the fabric, the bias goes the diagonal. And what that does is it gives us more stretch to our material that's not typically there when we cut it normally. So that means that when you're actually wearing the garment, this ease, and that's why I didn't put as much ease in this, it's actually gonna have a little bit of give to it, and it's gonna hang really nicely on your body compared to what you would have if you were just to cut it straight up and down. It'd be a lot more stiff. So with that being said, we have our hip measurement. We're gonna come down here to the floor, and we're gonna map out how we're going to cut. Okay, so we will map out our measurements now here on the floor. So let me get my cutting board and stuff all set up here. So I've got my fabric here. So again, like we were talking about, this is the selvage edge here where this nice little ruffle is. Instead of actually cutting our piece going this direction, we're gonna go diagonally. And so in order for us to get the most out of our fabric, to cut this diagonally and not have to recut both pieces twice separately, instead of folding it typically like they have the store selvage edge to selvage edge, we're going to fold it halfways. And if halfways is not enough, we'll map out how much it is here. If it's not enough for our pattern piece, we'll actually cut two different ones. Well, I was going to try this first because it's a lot easier to do it this way. So if I'm essentially, instead of cutting this direction, I'm cutting at the diagonal. This right here is my top. So my very top is going to be 25 inches across. So let's just see how much I have here. I'm feeling I'm going to have to use two different ones. So there's 25. I want 30 inches. I'm going to have to cut this twice. So we're not going to fold this. We're going to do it this way because you'll have more room. So we're going to cut this pattern piece twice. We'll cut it the first time by measuring it out, and then we will just transfer it over to the other part of the fabric. So make sure you can still see me here. Okay, so we're going to use this right angle as our baseline. So we want this whole piece, it's going to be a giant rectangle. We're going to go according to our hip. So whatever your hip measurement is, divided in half with the seam allowance and the ease is what we're going to do this as. So mine's 25 across. So I'm going to take this up to this corner where my 25 is, and I'm going to put pins. Or if you have Tailor's chalk, you can use that as well to mark my top. So I'm just going to mark my edge. I'm going to put the pins perpendicular to each other to know exactly where it's at. So I have my top edge marked now up here in these two corners. So now for our total length, our length when we actually measured it was 30. When we look at, we want to have our seam allowance for when we add our waistband up here. as well as our hem. So for our waistband is 1 inch wide. We want to make sure that we can encapsulate that 1 inch as well as have a finished seam on the inside. So for the actual waistband itself, I'm going to say we do add 1.5 inches to that. So let's go back to our board here for a minute so I can just kind of show you. So if our thing is 30 inches, we want to have an inch waistband and we want to finish it. I'm going to add 1.5 inches. That's just for the waistband. Now we're going to add what our seam allowance is going to be for the hem. I'm going to do a 2 rolled 1/4 inch hem, so it's going to be a total of 1/2. So for that, that equals 32 inches total for our length. So we'll come back down here. So we're back down here. We've already marked out what our total width is going to be. And then for our length, we're going to have whatever your length is plus 2 inches. So mine's 32. So I'm going to take that perpendicular. I'm going to make sure I go straight down to 32. Mark it. Perfect. Okay, so I've got my 32 and my 32 here. So just to confirm, we've got our 1/2 of our waist plus the seam allowance plus the total length. The thing about this is, especially since we don't have pattern pieces, we want to make sure that we have enough fabric to be able to cut all those out twice in the correct direction. So I'm looking at this right now, and if you can see where my pins are here and over here. If I cut out this panel here, it's not going to be able to be enough over here for the length. So what we're going to do, as opposed to doing it halfwise and going sideways, I'm going to take this far corner here. I'm going to fold it over this way. This should give us our maximum amount of length. And this is the thing about not having pattern pieces. So we're going to redo this here in a second. But the problem with not having pattern pieces is when you have pattern pieces, you can just pick it up and place it wherever you want. When you don't have pattern pieces, you got to play with it a little bit. So instead of having your fabric laying out like it is, you're going to fold it like you would like a bandana. So let's measure it again this way and see, and if not, we'll go back to regular and we won't do bias. Last time I did this, I had enough, but I may have picked for myself a fabric that's not quite wide enough, and that could be why I'm not getting my full bias, which is fine. If yours is at a bias, if you turn it like this and you can cut it like this and all that you need, that's totally fine. You can keep your bias. If not, don't worry about it. Number 25. Mine's not going to make it. So instead of cutting my own bias, I'm going to cut it regularly. If you want to cut it regularly, that's totally fine. I think I had picked a fabric that's not quite wide enough. The only other way to do this was then to, yeah. So I'm gonna cut mine regularly, so I'm gonna go back to this. So Bethany, if yours can go on the bias, go for it, just like I showed you the folding method there. If not, we'll just go back to this method. So I'm gonna match up my solid edges here. So now I'm going to measure out my 25 across and my 30 down. So 25 across. Corners. Just checking it. Yep, and then we're gonna go 30 down. So unlike the bias, we're gonna go diagonally. We're gonna go down the correct grain of the actual fabric. So go down whatever your length measurement is. So mine's going to be 32 because that's what we had for our length plus our seam allowance. And 32 over here. And then I also like to just put my midpoint through here too. So if I'm lining up these, stick a pin up here, or if you have a marking pen or Tailor's chalk, just kind of mark out your lines a little bit. Okay, so now we've got our two pattern pieces mapped out here, right? So we've got, we have our two pieces that we have marked out here. So we have our total half width with the seam allowance, as well as our full width. And make sure it's good through the center here. So this is the part where we can now chop. So make sure when you're doing this, you always want to make sure that you're holding your fabric while you're actually cutting it so it doesn't slide on you. So I'm just going to start from here. I'm going to cut down this direction first. And I'm going to keep that cut as straight as you possibly can. Go ahead and cut down this side as well. Again, keeping it as straight as you can. Top. And there's the bottom. Okay, and again, these two pieces are perfectly identical, so it doesn't matter which one you want to consider as your front or your back. They're going to be the same. And Bethany, let me know once you have yours cut out, and we will go from there. I will say that what's great about this happy accident that it wasn't wide enough and I had to do it long ways is that means I have like almost a whole yard to actually do something else with too. So we can use this for future projects. If you want to make like a matching set and do like a cowl neck, like little handkerchief crop top to wear with your skirt, this is like a perfect piece to use it with too. All right, well, I'll go ahead and continue. Y'all just let me know when you're ready.
Absolutely.
Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come over here to our sewing machine. So I'm going to show you guys how to do this French seam. For a French seam, typically when we're sewing, so these are our two right sides that we have together here. Typically when we're sewing, we always put right sides together and seam. That's a normal stitch. For French seams, what we're going to do is actually put wrong sides together first and sew them together, and then we flip it inside out. So I'll show you guys how to do this here. So we have our front and our back piece. And right now we're going to go down the side seams. So you put your wrong sides together. So here's my top, here's my bottom. We're going to put our wrong sides together here. What we're going to do is we're going to make a 1/2 inch, because our total seam allowance is 1 inch, right? So we're going to do 2 1/2 inch seams. We're first going to put these wrong sides together. We're going to stitch a 1/2 inch in here on our sewing machine. Then we're going to clip it down to a 1/4 inch, flip it back the other way, and stitch again. So go ahead and pin this guy together here. Yeah, and the thing is with the fabrics, a lot of times some of them are, like I said on mine, were not quite as wide. I would definitely say next time I need to make sure I pay attention, but make sure it's 56 inches wide. And if you truly wanted to do it on the bias, instead of doing 2 yards, I probably would have gone with 2.5 to 3, just to have extra. And then one thing that's sad about cutting along the bias is you have a lot of leftover fabric. What I found anytime that I've come along the bias and had leftover fabric, what I like to do is make little accessories out of it. So like hair ties or scrunchies, because there's a lot of smaller things that you can make with leftover fabric that can be a lot of fun. So I'm just pinning along here. This fabric, it's a crushed satin, so it is crazy slick. Honestly, there's a lot of fabrics that I'm at the point where I feel comfortable working without pins. When it comes to stuff this slick, I am not. I always make sure I pin, because you just never know. It likes to run away from you. Just starting up my machine here real quick. Okay, so like I said, we're going to sew a 1/2 inch in for our seam allowance down, and then we're going to flip it inside out after we clip. So let's do this side, and then we'll do the other side, and then we'll clip them both at the same time. So I'm a 1/2 inch in. As always, when you're sewing, when you start, you always want to back stitch a little bit at the beginning of your seam so it doesn't unravel on you. We're just going to follow this 1/2 inch guide all the way down our side seam. And as always, when we start and finish a seam, we're going to back stitch a little bit, make sure that puppy is sealed nice and tight without any unraveling. And we will clip. Now we're going to do the same exact thing to the other side of this fabric. So we'll go over here to our other side seam. And this guy all the way down.
Hi. I just have a clarifying question.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
is that what you're doing there?
Oh, can you repeat it one more time? You cut out.
Are you doing a double stitch?
Yeah, so I'm doing what's called a French seam. So what we're doing is we're putting the wrong sides together first. We're gonna stitch down. What we'll do is we'll clip that seam allowance and then flip it the opposite direction and stitch again. So essentially, yeah, there'll be two different seams that we're doing.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So again, we're going in a 1/2 inch here. Our wrong sides are together, which is contrary to what a normal stitch would be. Back stitch on the end of our seam, and then continue down with our seams. Okay. So we've stitched our wrong sides together here. So we have our two side seams with the wrong ends, which means that right now, if you were to look at your skirt, you see this seam. So we're actually going to encapsulate this seam that we just made. But first, since we're doing a 1/2 inch seam again, we need to clip this seam allowance a little bit. So we'll go back over here on the floor for a moment. And I'm just going to trim that edge back from what it is right now. It's a 1/2 inch. I'm going to trim it to be more close to a 1/4 inch. Just trim it up a little bit. So that way when we flip it back the other way, none of this will actually be seen. It's basically cutting our seam allowance in half. So I literally just took half off of what we just sewed on seam allowance. Do the same thing to the other side. So I'm literally going to cut this seam allowance in half again on this side. So you want to stay a little bit away from your actual seam so you don't clip it. All right, so I took that off. So now we're going to flip our skirt inside out. So now we're looking at the inside of our skirt. As you can see, because we stitched it on the wrong sides first, that means we have this really nice clean edge already on the interior. And what we're going to do, we'll iron this out first, but we're going to stitch again, but now this time with the right sides facing together, a 1/2 inch in. So when it's actually stitched, we have a clean edge on the exterior. All right, so we're going to go over here to the iron. And I'm just going to iron out that edge so it lays nice and flat, so that way when we actually put it through the sewing machine, it doesn't want to roll on us. So we want this seam to lay really nice and flat. So again, you have your skirt flipped out, right side out, or wrong side in. You're looking at the interior. I'm just going to iron. This nice and flat. Don't be afraid to use a little steam if you have a synthetic fabric. Okay, so that's the one side. And then we'll iron out this other seam on the opposite side. Again, this is just to get it to lie flat, so we put it back underneath the sewing machine to do the other stitch. Seam down the way. It is nice and flat for us and won't roll. Okay, so now that we have our seams really nice and ironed flat, I'm going to lay it actually on its seam edge and iron that flat, nice part back down, so that way our seam is truly on that outside seam and it lays flat. So now I have this seam, it's really nice and flat and crisp, so we can literally sew straight down here without any issues of rolling. We'll do the other side as well. And really, you could have flipped this out and just pinned it flat and done this, but I will tell you, it's just so much easier if you have access to an iron to do it. It's a lot less frustration in the long run. Just ironing this seam out to lie flat. Okay, so now we have our two side seams. We have our skirt inside out. We've ironed them extremely flat. So now we're gonna go back over here to our sewing machine and do another stitch a 1/2 inch in. And that's going to encapsulate this raw edge so we don't have any of it on the exterior of our skirt. So now we've got our wonderful flat edge here. We're gonna do the same amount of seam allowance, so a 1/2 inch. So we've cut away to a 1/4 inch on that seam allowance. And again, straight stitch down, so back stitch at the top and continue on down. I'll flip this out so you can see what it looks like. Now that we've encapsulated it, we have this beautiful clean seam now on the outside, as well as a clean seam now on the inside. So there's no raveling whatsoever. Everything's nice and tucked in. This kind of stitch works really great with lighter weight or flowy fabric. So in this case, if we're using satins or a similar type fabric, it's really great because then you don't have to put it through a serger. A lot of times, the more delicate fabric you have, the less needles and stitches that you want in it because it'll cause it to pull. So again, now we're on our other side seam. Same thing, 1/2 inch all the way down our side seam. Skirt still inside out. We're going to encapsulate that raw edge. Okay, so just to show you guys, so I have it inside out right now. I'm going to turn it right side out so I can show you this seam we just did. So now we have our side seams completely together. So now we have a beautiful clean seam on the exterior as well as the interior. Okay, so now we have basically our skirt before we put in the elastic and we put in the hem. So I'm going to go over the seams that we just did one more time. I'm going to press these out so they lay nice and flat for us. So that way when we start working at the top, it's less fidgety. So I'm just going to iron out these side seams that we just did just so they lay flat. So there's my one side ironed nice and flat. Into the other side. Okay, so now I have my side seams all nice and flat. So next we're going to tackle the waistband. So for our waistband, the measurement that we took earlier for our actual waist is what we're going to cut our elastic for on this band. So if your waist measurement, you want the full amount of your waist for this. So my waist measure is 29, and honestly, the way that I like to do this is literally take my elastic, go around my waist, and then I want to go an additional inch past where they meet, so that way I can stitch it closed. So I'm going to cut right there. So my waist measurement's 29, so I'm actually going to cut right at about 30 for my elastic. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create ourselves a clean edge first before we put our elastic on here. That'll make sure that when we flip our elastic in there, we have no raw edges on the interior of our skirt. So we're going to take, and again, it doesn't matter which edge because the top and the bottom are the same exact measurement. First, I'm going to trim my stringies here. This fabric is very, very frayy. So essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to turn our fabric here 1/4 of an inch in and stitch, and then we're going to do another 1/4 inch and stitch. So take a look at your fabric. If we have seams like this that are not completely together, once we've now stitched it closed, just ease out this stitch. And what I mean by that, or this line, what I mean by that is clip it and just take the edge off. And that'll happen, especially if you have kind of silky fabrics. They're going to shift on you when you sew. So again, as you can see on this one, he's a little off here. So I'm just going to clip and even that line up. So when we sew, we have no crazy edges that we have to deal with. Take a look at your fabric, and this is probably going to be easiest for you if you pin it. I'm going to grab my ruler. So you're going to fold your fabric 1/4 inch in, which is really small. And then you're going to fold in another 1/4 inch. So a total of 1/2 inch of your fabric is being used for this seam allowance before we put in our elastic. So fold and pin. And this is honestly the time-consuming part because you're going to go all the way around this edge and do the same thing. All the way around. And this is also the same amount that you're going to do for your hem as well. Do y'all have any questions so far?
So you're saying that we're going to fold in 1/4 of an inch 2 times.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yep, so there's my one, and then I'm going to do it again. So that way there's no raw edges showing.
Okay, we're working on it. We're working on it.
I know
it
takes a long time, and especially if the fabric is really soft and silky, it's like it can be infuriating as you're going along because you're like, it just won't stay. So just take your time. It's totally okay. This is honestly probably the most annoying, painstaking part of this process of this skirt. And I'll say that I love this skirt because, I mean, I'll tell you the red one that I wore back around the holidays, I wore it to death. And I loved it because it's easy. It's literally, we were doing an elastic waistband. You just pull it on, but it looks so elegant. And it goes with, I mean, everything. I wore a cute little white sweater with it. I've worn a black bodysuit with it, with little boots. I've worn it here now towards the summer with a black tank and some cute shoes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
How thick is your elastic? Because I know I have a little thin elastic, but when you normally do your stitching, what what
Mm-hmm.
what is the better size to be able to utilize?
For the elastic for the waistband.
Yes.
So I tend to stay towards a 3/4 to a 1 inch elastic. So because you want enough on it to where if you use a thinner elastic, what's going to happen is your fabric is going to want to roll on you the thinner that you use. So like for instance, these pants that I'm wearing, this is only a 1/2 inch elastic, and it's decent, it's okay, but it does sometimes want to like to roll a little bit. So the thicker that you have up here, the better it's going to stay positioned where it wants to be.
Okay.
So I personally am going to use a 1 inch.
Mm-hmm.
So that way it won't roll on you. Now for thinner elastics, other projects that you will want to use, so cases that you'll want a thinner elastic would be like if you were doing like a little cuff on a, like if you were doing a sleeve that you wanted elastic at the bottom, that's where you'd want a thinner elastic. But for larger surface areas on your body, you typically tend to want a thicker elastic, especially in this case, it is technically our waistband on the internal of it. You'll want 3/4 inch to an inch. All right, so now that I've got my seam pinned here, again, it's a total of a 1/2 inch, but what we're going to do is we're going to stitch it right along the 1/4. And actually it's going to be slightly under 1/4 because our fabric is at the 1/4. So we're going to stitch right along this edge here to create a clean edge before we attach our elastic. So I'm just encapsulating this. And this, again, this is the same exact thing that we're going to do for our hemline. So this is just honestly really good practice for when we do the hem here in a minute as well. And if you're doing this seam and you're like, I want to use this as my hem and use the other end as my elastic waistband, that's totally fine too. So again, we're stitching just under 1/4 here to make a clean line for when we attach our elastic. So again, I'm just stitching a little under 1/4 inch to create our clean edge that we had just folded under, all the way around the end of the skirt. And again, this is the same exact stitch we're going to do for our hem as well. And got to my end here, back stitch, and we're done with that bit. Okay, so now we have our beautiful finished edge here. Again, this is going to be the same thing that we're doing for our hem. So next we're going to add our elastic to this. So I had pre-cut my elastic. So my waist is 29 inches. I cut 30 total. And what I will do is I'm going to overlap my elastic by about 1 inch here. And I'm going to sew it shut to make my loop before we attach it to the skirt. I'm going to do 2 stitches here, one on this side. And I leave that whole inch in there because if you ever want to go back and alter your skirt, either to let this elastic out at all, you can. And that way you have a little bit of wiggle room in there. And then do the other side so that way it's not flapping. And then just closing that elastic loop up. I got pins all over the place. Okay, so now we've got our loop for our elastic waistband. As we know, this is actually quote unquote our hip measurement. and we have a smaller waist than our hip. So what we're essentially going to do, let me get this all set up right so that way there's no issues.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
No,
So
you're good.
you're saying that the size of the elastic should be the size of the hips?
No, so the elastic's gonna be the size of your waist. What we had cut our fabric on was our hip, because the widest part, I'll flip this around and show you. The widest part of where most people's body is our hip, right? So if I were to slip this over me, which we don't have the hem done yet, that's fine. It'll fit easily over my hips, but obviously my waist is smaller than my hips. So the elastic that we're gonna put up here is gonna bring this in on the inside so it fits our waist as well as our hips. Does it make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to make sure, because I was talking to Bethany, so I wanted to make sure that I understood what you were saying.
Yes, yep. That is correct. So I'll show you guys kind of what I was pinning here as I was chatting with you. So what we're gonna do now, so we have, of course, so our waist here is obviously much larger than our elastic, which is our total. So what I have done is I've taken my side seams here with my loop and I've pinned them. So you have all your stuff hanging in excess half down. You're going to stretch your elastic out to where it fills the interior of your skirt like so, and you're going to pin it. I know, really professional grabbing with my mouth, but I don't have forearms. And the way I'm pinning this elastic is I'm putting the elastic all the way to the inside of where we just stitched. So it's a full inch, right, which is the inch that we included in our seam allowance. So I'm going to pin it on the interior along the edge of where we just had here, because what we're going to do is stitch along this top here, and we're going to flip it. So on the outside, you won't see our elastic at all. So again, I'm just filling the skirt with the elastic. We're pinning the elastic on the interior of the skirt along the edge. And the fun part of this is when we stitch this, you're actually going to have to pull your elastic along as you sew.
So this is where I'm at right now.
Oh, nice. Okay. So is that your side seam?
Yes.
Perfect. Yep, that looks
So
good.
she has to sew it on the outside now.
Yes. So you'll put the wrong sides together. So your insides will be touching each other. You're going to sew along that seam, and then you'll clip that seam to be a little bit smaller on the seam allowance, and then you'll flip it.
And then just sew along this side up here.
Yes. So now I've got my waistband all put in on the inside here of my skirt. So again, it's on the interior up to the edge of where we just stitched. We're going to follow this same stitch that we just did here all the way around while stretching this out to hit all of our points. So that's why I put a lot of pins in here to make sure it's where it needs to be. So now we're going to stitch this elastic into our skirt. So I'm going to start at one of the pins. I'm actually going to sew this in the exterior because it's going to look prettier that way, I think. I'm going to follow this line better. So start at one of the pins. Again, so between your elastic and your stitches, you're actually going to pull out the elastic so that way it fills the entire portion of the fabric, and stitch along here. So I'll start with my back stitch, stretching my elastic, keeping that lined up right with the edge of my elastic. I'll stitch my next pin. Make sure you keep it taut as you go along. So I'm stitching my elastic in 1/4 inch in, just like we did on this seam, or close to 1/4 inch. Keeping it lined up. Almost there. So again, this is just to fixate the elastic on the interior of the skirt, because what we're going to do next is flip this elastic over, and we're going to stitch in the ditch is what it's called, and I will show you guys what I mean here. Finish out this elastic, and as you can see, there's a lot of gathering on this. That's fine. It's going to be on the interior of your shirt. You're not going to see this at all. Okay, so I've got my. This is what it should look like now that you have your elastic fixated in here. So again, it's on the interior of where we just stitched this. So you have your elastic taking up the entirety of your skirt. What we're going to do is we're going to flip this elastic over by one on each of our side seams here. So like so. We're going to pin it. The same thing to the other side. Pin it. So now we have our elastic flipped to the inside, so we don't see any of the craziness that was on the interior. And so, I'll go a long way. So now that we have our elastic flipped over, which is our 1 inch that we accounted for in our seam allowance from the top to bottom, when we're looking at the exterior of our skirt here, this stitch right here, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch right inside this seam. So instead of coming across this way to where you'll see the stitches, we're literally going to put our needle right here where this seam is, so that way we secure our elastic so it doesn't want to roll out on us when we wear it on our side seam. So we'll do one over here, and then we'll do one on the opposite side. So I'll get you guys really close so you can see. So here's my elastic that's rolled over. I'm looking at the exterior of my skirt. I'm going to stitch just right through here a little bit down the length of my elastic so it stays nice and clean. So I'm in that little stitched groove that we already had. I'm going to stitch down that whole inch to the end of where my elastic is. You'll feel it. And then I'm going to back stitch right back out of where I came from. So that way your stitch, when they call it stitching in the ditch, when it's in that seam, it's literally invisible. So now I've stitched right here, and now my elastic won't roll out on me. It's staying. I'll do the same thing to the other side. So again, we're going to stitch right inside of this seam. All the way down the width of that elastic and all the way back out. Okay. So now our elastic is turned into the inside. I'll put it on so y'all can see it. Now that we've taken that elastic to the inside, when you're wearing your skirt, since your elastic is on the inside, you won't see it. Because your elastic is now, instead of being here, it's wrapped in. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do, which is the very last step, is we're going to hem our skirt. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing that we did when we finished the interior by this elastic. We're going to turn it a 1/4 inch and then a 1/4 inch again, and then we'll stitch it up. So we're going to pin this and do this. I'm going to do this the quicker way, as I like to call it. I'm actually going to roll it as I go. It's, for me, I've had a lot of experience doing it, so it's going to be easier. What you would do is you would pin it the same way that we did earlier, going all the way around and pinning just like we did. So I'm going to be a little daring. I'm going to fold as I go. So again, I'm just doing a quarter and a quarter. And stitching. I'm just trimming my frayed edges here so they don't stick out when I finish my sleeve. So a quarter and a quarter. Rolling that over. And stitching. And so this will be our final step of our skirt. So again, we're turning it a quarter and a quarter. And stitching probably close between 1/8 and 1/4 inch on our actual lines in our sewing machine because we want to make sure that we're getting all of our seam. And remember, if you at any point you do a seam and you don't like it, that is what a seam ripper is for. And trust me, you will use it regularly. I've been sewing for years and I still use it regularly. And again, if y'all want a tighter fitting skirt, once you do your initial French seams, if you feel like it needs to be brought in more at the hip, feel free to do it at that point. That's totally okay. Some people like a closer fit. I personally like it to be a little looser on my hip so I have more room to move. But now, since y'all have constructed your skirt, you know how to put it back together again, doing alterations on your own garment is not overly difficult. Here we are. Clip that. And that's our skirt. So we have our waistband. We've now stitched in the seam up top. When we put it on, it will look like so. Yep, so when you finish, everything should be encapsulated in here. I'd even, like looking at my skirt now, I'm looking here in the mirror. I probably, knowing that I could, if I were to do anything, I would probably go back on my original piece and maybe take in the waist a little bit more so there wasn't as much gathered up top. And that just depends on your body type. Some people, I know for me, because my hip to waist ratio is significantly larger, I would probably take more out of this waist than what most people would have. If you have a smaller waist to hip ratio, you could probably get away with just continuing to do like the hip, because I think it's perfect on the hip. It's not too tight, it's not too loose, but as you can see, there's a lot of extra fabric here in the waist. So I probably would have taken it a little bit.
And what kind of fabric is it that you have there?
Yeah, so I went to Joanne. It's actually a crushed satin. It's very similar to a creped back satin. It just means that it has, instead of a normal satin, most of them are just flat, like this is a slip dress I made last week. This, where there's no really texture to it. This one actually has a little slight texture to it, and it has a softer drape. So it's really, it like lays really nicely, as opposed to a regular satin, which is a little bit more crisp. It has a little more body to it. So when you're making this skirt, I would suggest something that has really nice drape. So I would say a crushed satin. I would say you could use a crepe back satin. You could use a charmeuse, but anything that's a little bit thinner and drapes really nicely and is soft to the hand is what you'll want for your skirt. And I got 2 yards, but since we did it like lengthwise instead of bias-wise, I probably could have gotten away with just 1.5 yards of material. And when y'all are done, you definitely want to go back over your hem and just iron it out so it lays a little flatter.
So yay, we did the skirt. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. I'm so glad y'all came.
And it's a lot easier to describe and show in person than it is on a screen.
I understand completely.
The more that you can even just practice little things like your stitches and stuff and research, do it if you can. Because even sewing by hand, it's a lot harder, but it'll teach you a lot more before you even get your hands on a machine. So that's awesome.
Great. All right. Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Bye.
Thank you guys for coming.